all very much for coming to this very special Russian and East European Studies Network event, which is entitled Human Rights 30 Years After Andrei Sakharov. And let's just begin with our customary acknowledgement and gratitude for the fact that the Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. Today, we are very fortunate to welcome to Queens Tatiana Yankelevich. It's a real honor. She is currently an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and she is the daughter of Andrei Sakharov, the foremost Soviet dissident and the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975. Now, some of you are quite young. So for those of you who are less familiar with the name of Andrei Sakharov, just a few words of introduction. He was originally best known as a theoretical physicist, and he was called the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb. But by the 1960s and 1970s, Sakharov had become a very vocal critic of the Cold War arms race and also of the authoritarian nature of the Soviet regime. The Soviet Union, in response to his dissident activities, refused to let him travel to Oslo to accept the Nobel Prize, and it kept him under house arrest until 1985. He became such a symbol of bravery in the face of authoritarianism in the 1970s and 1980s that to this day the European Parliament awards the Sakharov Prize annually to dissidents and activists around the world. So he was a very well-known and beloved figure during the time of the Soviet Union. In advance of the upcoming 2021 commemoration of the centenary of his birth, Tatiana Yankelevich is here. And she is going to help us explore Sakharov's life and legacy. We are going to begin today with this panel here. These Canadian scholars will all discuss the Jewish dissident nexus in the Soviet Union. We will then break for coffee, to which all are welcome. And we will have our keynote speech by Tatiana Yankelevich following that, who will discuss the multifaceted legacy of Andrei Sakharov. After her talk, please join us for a reception right here in the atrium. And then this evening at 6:30, it's really a packed day full of events. This evening at 6:30, this whole event will move over to the screening room on Princess Street in downtown Kingston, where we will screen a documentary about Sakharov, followed by a question and answer session with Tatiana. A fun fact for all of you that you may not know, Tatiana is actually following in the footsteps of her mother, Yelena Boner, by coming to Queens today. Almost 30 years ago, in 1991, Yelena Boner came to Queens to deliver a speech in celebration of Queens' 150th anniversary, and she received an honorary degree here. So this is kind of a special moment for all of us. 30 years later, we are able to host Tatiana. And tomorrow, actually, it's a really exciting part of her visit here. Tatiana will actually go to the Queen's Archives to view materials from that 1991 event. So it's very special for her as well. Before we begin our event, I would really like to say a few words about our group, which is the Russian and East European Studies Network at Queens. We're very young. We were formed 2 years ago because many of us felt that there was a real absence of the study of Russia and Eastern Europe here at Queens, and we wanted to bring greater awareness of this region of the world to Queens. We're an interdisciplinary group of scholars. We have history, we have philosophy, we have politics, and we've brought a wide variety of events, not just this one, to Queens in our short 2 years, including a film series, several informational sessions on current events in Russia and Eastern Europe, and talks by professors from Queens and beyond. And I encourage you that if you want to learn more about our events, we have a sign-up sheet in the back. You just put your email address down, and we can inform you about future events. Now, in a moment, I'm going to be introducing our panel, and we have to come to this moment at every event. Any event of this nature simply requires an extraordinary amount of gratitude. And so, Please let me express it. In the first place, I want to thank the Nugent Fund of the History Department at Queen's, as well as the Jewish Studies program, for very generously funding this event, this full-day event. Thank you also to the Agnes Etherington Center for use of their space. Thank you to the panelists and to Tatiana for coming all this way to speak to us. I am very grateful to you as well. I want to thank also all of the members of our Beast Committee. Everyone participated in the planning of this event, and I am very grateful for all the help that I received in putting this thing together. One last thank you, a very special one, to Vasily Shedrin, our moderator for the panel. Without him, this event would not have been possible, and so I apologize to everyone else, but I really need to mention him by name, thanking him, and I'll introduce him in a moment as the moderator of our panel. All right, now we can begin the exciting events of the day. So let's turn to the panel. We're very pleased to have 4 interesting people talk about the question of dissidents and Jews who tore the Iron Curtain. We would like to begin today with Dr. Gordon Dueck, who completed his master's degree at Dalhousie under the supervision of Daniel Wolfe, and then received his PhD at Queen's under the supervision of the late Gerald Tuchinski, who actually wrote the biography of communist politician Joseph Salzberg, who will be the subject of Gordon's talk. Dr. Dueck specializes in modern Jewish history and teaches courses on the Holocaust, the Jewish history of Hollywood, and secular Jewish identity at Queen's. He will speak on the topic of a eulogy for Stalin, J.B. Salzberg, and the Canadian Jewish communist experience. Next, we will have Paul Goldberg. He's the editor and publisher of The Cancer Letter. He joined this publication in 1986, and as a writer, many of his stories have had a profound impact on the field of oncology, leading to congressional investigations and changes in policy in the United States. For example, Paul uncovered a key element of a scandal at a genomics research group at Duke University, which led to retractions of papers in the world's premier medical journals and the appointment of a committee of the Institute of Medicine. His reporting has been recognized in many prestigious places: the Washington, D.C. Professional Chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, the Gerald Loeb Awards, the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and the Newsletter and Electronic Publishers Foundation. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Washington Monthly. He has written books both on his subject of health and also on the question of Jews, and especially Jews in the Soviet Union. So his books include How We Do Harm, The Doctor Breaks Ranks About Being Sick in America, The Yid by Macmillan Publishers, and The Chateau by Picador, The Thaw Generation, Coming of Age in the Post-Stalin Era, with Lyudmila Alexeyeva, and The Final Act, and To Live Like Everyone, a translation of a memoir of the late dissident Anatoly Marchenko. Paul today will speak on the human rights movement and the Jewish immigration movement similarities and differences. Third, we have Komaromi here from Toronto. She is Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Slavic Languages and Literatures and Acting Director of the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. Professor Komaromi leads the project for the study of dissidents and samizdat, a digital humanities project at the University of Toronto Libraries. She's currently completing a book manuscript on samizdat journals and their publics in the Soviet Union. Her first book, Uncensored, The Quest for Autonomy in Samizdat Novels, treated works by Vasily Aksanov, Andrei Vitov, and Benedict Erefeev. She edited and introduced Yuliy Kosharkovsky's We Are Jews Again, A History of the Jewish Movement in the Soviet Union. She is collaborating with Michael Weiser of Hebrew University on a book on the revival of Jewish life in Leningrad in the 1980s. The title of her talk is Sakharov and Dissident Chronotypes. And finally, and especially, I'm going to be introducing Tatiana much more fully before her talk, but I'd like to give you a sense of who she is before this panel. She received her cum laude degree in Russian literature from Moscow University. She immigrated to the United States shortly thereafter, where she worked as an educator in the field of post-World War II Soviet history and the Soviet human rights movement. She has taught at Bentley College and has given multiple lectures across the United States at various universities. She has campaigned extensively on behalf of Andrei Sakharov. She has maintained his archives, translated his correspondence and other materials, and has participated in the publication of his writings, including his memoirs in 1990, and also the works by her mother, Alone Together and Mothers and Daughters. She is currently an associate at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. She will speak today on the Jewish activist movement in the context of the Soviet dissident and human rights movements. Finally, last but not least, Vasily Shedrin, who is our moderator today. He received his PhD in modern Jewish history from Brandeis University, and since then he has taught at many campuses in North America and overseas. Currently, Dr. Shedrin is the Alfred and Isabel Bader Postdoctoral Fellow in Jewish History in the Department of History at Queen's University. Dr. Shedrin's many publications on the cultural and political history of Russian Jewry include his book, Jewish Souls, Bureaucratic Minds, Jewish Bureaucracy and Policymaking in Late Imperial Russia. Currently, Dr. Shedrin is working on the biography of Solomon Mikhails, the beloved star of the Moscow Yiddish theater and informal leader of the Soviet Jews. And with those distinguished introductions of such distinguished scholars, I now turn to Vasily, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the panel and moderate the panel as
well. Thank you very much, Anna, for the introduction. And I join in thanking whoever was taking Anna's speech. It's really wonderful that we are meeting here and talking about Andrei Sakharov. And we have such wonderful panelists here and the keynote speaker. A few words about the panel. I will make my participation minimal because we have the very interesting contributions. So I just briefly introduce the panel. The panel's title is Dissidents and Jews Who Tore the Iron Curtain. And it's the title of a book I read many years ago. It was originally published in Russia in 1981 in Israel. And frankly, I don't remember what this book was about, but the title just stuck on my mind. And in our recent conversations with Paul, who's currently working on a novel on this topic, I thought it would be an interesting topic for discussion here. We're always thinking, well, stereotypically, we assume that the dissident opposition movement in the Soviet Union was sort of monolithic, which it was not. And here we will try to explore what was the diversity of this movement. And doing this, we would starting rewriting this sort of lost chapter in Soviet Russian and Jewish history. And with this introduction, let me invite the first speaker, Professor Dueck.
Nazi rise to power, they were now taking over large sections of Montreal and Toronto, especially the Spadina area. The reason why Queens ultimately decided against openly declaring war against Jews, as McGill has done, was because the MPP, representing Spadina, had written a bill in 1944, which had been passed into law preventing them from doing so. The Racial Discrimination Act of 1944 was the first human rights legislation in Ontario. And the author was J.B. Salzberg, a Jewish communist. Legend has it that when Salzberg rose to speak in the provincial parliament in Toronto, that word would spread to the nearby campus of the U of T. Joe was on his feet. People would cry, and students would run to Queen's Park and fill the gallery to hear him. I doubt that happens much anymore. One wonders how many were there on March 6, 1953, almost 67 years ago today, the day after Stalin's death, when Salzberg suddenly, and almost casually, delivered the following remarks. First, from the answer, the clerk of the House says, 26th order resuming the adjourned debate on the motion for second reading of Bill number 80. Mr. Salzberg from St. Andrew. Mr. Speaker, before proceeding with my remarks on Bill number 80, I would like, with your permission, to say a few words about the passing of Joseph Stalin, Premier of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and one of the greatest personalities of our time. His death is a severe loss to the peoples who make up the Soviet Union, to all who strive for a peaceful world, to hundreds of millions of workers and farmers throughout the world who aspire to attain a free social society in which exploitation of man by man and strife between peoples will forever be ended. Stalin combined within himself various gifts of unusual greatness. His leadership qualities are exemplified by the major role he played in the transformation of an industrially backward country into one of the most advanced states in the world. His military genius was universally acknowledged in the unforgettable struggle which the Soviet army and people carried on under his leadership as our allies against the Nazi hordes. His theoretical works rank him as one of the foremost thinkers of our time. Only a few short years ago, the portrait of Stalin, together with those of the late President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, adorned all government office buildings and all public places of our country and of all freedom-loving countries as symbols of the united struggle against Nazism and fascism. I am confident that the colonies, which have been directed for so long against Stalin, will, as time goes on, sink into oblivion, and the figure of Stalin will emerge and remain in history as one of the greatest among the great of all times. In conclusion, said Salzberg, I want to express my sincere hope that Stalin's repeated declaration of the possibility and need for the peaceful coexistence between the socialist and non-socialist sectors of the world will become the guiding policy of Canada and of all states. It is in the acceptance of this basic policy of peaceful coexistence that we can find the only road to lasting peace, friendship, and cooperation between peoples and states of the world. Now, Mr. Speaker, turn to the living. I would like to join with those who congratulate the honorary leader of the opposition, Mr. Oliver, on his birthday. 2 years later, he lost his seat in the provincial parliament. 4 years later, he left the party and became an insurance salesman. Was it because of Khrushchev's revelations in 1956 that he departed his party? Or did he know about Stalin's persecution of the Jews before he delivered these words? What did he know? He knew or suspected just about everything. The arrest of the Jewish anti-fascist committee in 1948, the doctor's plot, the murder of the Yiddish poets in 1952. He did not always toe the party line, and indeed was disciplined on more than one occasion for his insubordination by the Communist Party of Canada. But he kept his criticisms of the party an internal affair, never expressing his discontent in public. Who was he? Salzberg was born in Poland, Poland, in 1902. His parents Joe took religious instruction until he was 16. In the meantime, he quit school to work in the needle trades around age 13. As a teenager, he helped organize the millinery workers to unionize and was a founding member of the local labor Zionists. It wasn't until 1928 that he joined the Communist Party of Canada, renamed, by the way, the Labour Progressive Party after 1940 for legal reasons. It was illegal to be communist. Along the way, he organized the auto workers in Oshawa and the Great Lakes sailors, trying to navigate the shifting policies from Moscow about labor. He entered politics as a city councillor, representing Ward 4, which is Kensington Market, where garment workers were concentrated. And then from 1943, the period that we're going to talk about, from 43 to 55, he was the MPP, the member of the provincial parliament, for St. Andrews, which is a street in Kensington Market. Kensington Market is now multicultural. It used to be the Jewish district, the Jewish market. He fought for African Canadian rights as well as Jewish rights, and was extremely popular with his constituents. He was not an ideologue, but a pragmatist. Jerry Tolchinsky, his biographer, has said that it would take Joe Salzberg 3 to 5 hours to stroll along Spadina Avenue from College to Queen, because he couldn't venture more than a few steps without meeting someone and having a conversation. And although a committed Marxist, he still celebrated Jewish holidays with his family. Salzberg traveled to the Soviet Union on several occasions, had even once spoken to the widow of David Bergson, one of the murdered poets. In 1955, as a delegate of the United Jewish People's Order. The United Jewish People's Order was an amalgamation of workmen's circle fraternal orders. He had an audience with Premier Nikolai Khrushchev, where he expressed his concerns regarding the fate of the Soviet Union's Jews. He was told that the secret police chief, Lavrentiy Beria, was at fault, and that the Jews were not his only victims. Quote from Joe Salzberg: "I was urged to be patient. All those falsely arrested were being freed and rehabilitated. When he inquired about the fate of intellectuals, artists and actors like Mikkelsen, Bergelsen, Pfeffer, Markin, Kvitko, Hofstein, and Derniston, he was told again, innocent people had been killed, and not only Jews." According to Tolchinsky, publicly Salzberg, after returning from the Soviet Union, still continued to toe the party line. Writing in the newspaper Der Wochenblatt about his trip, he wrote about the Soviet Union: "The tremendous rate of construction and the universal desire for peace, these two manifestations of life in the Soviet Union, constitute the major impressions of life there. He gave no he gave no hint of his rising angst. In truth, however, he was deeply disappointed. It seemed that he'd been trying to outlast Stalin, in the hopes that things would change back to the time of it. Stalin's death did not usher in a new era, however, or a return to the tolerance of Yiddishkeit that had prevailed under Lenin and the original Soviet Union. Khrushchev, as Canadian Communist leader Tim Buckley put it, was an anti-Semite too. At one point, Khrushchev put his arm around Joe Salzberg and said, "Besides, you know as well as I do, dear comrade, wherever Jews settle, they erect synagogues." Salzberg recounted his impression. Quote, "Khrushchev's approach to the problems of the Jewish people is an unforgivable violation of socialist democracy. If Khrushchev's distrust of the Jewish people is justified, then it is a terrible indictment not of the Soviet Jews, but of the Stalinist crimes and distortions of their nationalities policy in general, and particularly as applied to the Jewish people." In 1957, Salzberg left the party, as did the United Jewish People's Order, of which he remained a member. He left politics behind, for he had no place to go. He was too far left to join the CCF. does too. Salzberg tried to explain his past on a CBC radio broadcast. He was on a panel with Stephen Spender and Arthur Kessler about their book, The God That Failed, a collection of essays by disillusioned communists, many of them Jewish. Salzberg stated on CBC that while Stalin, who was defined as the god of communism, proved to be a most disillusioning and disastrous failure, the God which the Kesslers, the Spenders, and I began to worship was one that encompassed the broad concepts of socialism with its egalitarianism, its social and political democracy, and universal brotherhood. We cannot say that that God has failed, he said, for he is yet to be reached. Thank you.
Dissidents and refuseniks inhabited very different universes, and they set off very different sequelae across the globe. Let's look at how these differences played out, sometimes visibly and sometimes beneath the surface. The human rights movement, the dissidents, are very small, or were very small, and then let's say elite group. People who knew each other, who trusted each other completely. Some of them were Jewish, but their Jewish identity wasn't always the only thing driving them. Jewishness was put in perspective of a broader question of human rights. Immigration, for example, is a human right. Practicing your religion is also a human right. In the human rights movement, there are two themes. The first theme was issuing an invitation to the government to engage in the dialogue of society, or else how are you going to get past totalitarianism. The second theme is to seek observance of Soviet laws and documenting failure to observe Soviet laws and obligations under international agreements. Hence, the idea for what is now known as the Human Rights Watch movement. It's a strategy that results in democratization and the beginning of democracy, and that's really what brought down communism, I would argue. Seen through this prism, the prism of human rights, the Jewish immigration movement is just one of many abuses of human rights by the Soviet government. The human rights movement wasn't about escape. It was about the human face, socialism with the human face, free market with the human face. The human face is what really matters. While the human rights movement initially had a small following outside the the USSR, the Jewish movement was getting massive support from Jews living in the West. The Jewish movement is an exodus. Can an exodus be exclusive? Moses had to take all comers, including the camel thieves. Dissidents were a self-selected group. Refuseniks, people whose petition to emigrate was denied, were ultimately selected by the KGB. They were the ones who said, you come, you go. At least they had some say in it. Some of these folks were wonderful, honorable people. Others were KGB plans. And they were, of course, panoramically visible to the KGB as a movement. The dissident movement was committed to nonviolence, as was the Jewish movement, albeit with one very puzzling exception. In 1970, a group of Jews failed spectacularly in their attempt to hijack a plane in Leningrad. The plan was to hijack a plane using, actually they had a small pistol, and replace the pilots and fly to Sweden, I believe. This action, something called Operation Wedding, they were pretending to go to a wedding, was a gift to the KGB. Now imagine this scenario where I can go to my CV, for example, and say, hey, a bunch of us are planning to hijack a plane to come Syracuse and fly to Cuba. Are you in? Right? Vasily would be right to be concerned about my sanity, and he might also worry whether this is a setup by the FBI or maybe the mounted police or whoever. He definitely should stay off that plane, if only because he has no reason to trust my ability to fly. This is also understandably in the same territory as Black September, because the gun's not a good thing. And yet, it was, of course, nothing really happened. It was an attempt, but they were stopped in America. And yet, it was the international prestige of the USSR that ended up taking a big hit. The entire world seemed inspired by this bold act and appalled by the Soviet response, which was excessive and included handing down death sentences to two principal organizers of this operation. Instead of showing the problematic picture of this action, the Soviets ended up making heroes and almost martyrs. This action went hand in hand with formation of the militant wing of the Jewish movement in the U.S. Rabbi Meir Kahane, who would later lead an ultra-right-wing Kaddish movement in Israel, and ultimately getting assassinated. In the U.S., JDO was setting off smoke bombs and actual bombs, shooting into residences of Soviet diplomats, blowing up various offices, including the office of Saul Hurak, a Jewish impresario, where they ended up inadvertently murdering an office worker in the bookkeeping section. She died of a smoking inhalation. She was Jewish, by the way. After two of the hijackers were sentenced to die, JDL threatened that if the executions were to take place, it would reciprocate by assassinating 4 Soviet diplomats. Now, Alan Dershowitz, the same guy who recently represented Donald Trump in the impeachment proceedings, appeared as the attorney for Kahane's thugs, literally helping them get away with murder. So, in the early 1970s, the dissidents in the USSR are a small elite group that has very little support in the West. Meanwhile, the Jewish immigration movement takes everyone, including the people whose sanity, ethics, or strategic thinking are open to challenge, is growing rapidly both in the USSR and in the West. I have so far mentioned only the Jewish Defense League. This, of course, is the extreme right wing and a very, very small part of it. There was also the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews and the Students' Struggle for Soviet Jewry and the 33s in London. There were the Canadian grassroots groups as well, and indeed when I say grassroots, I mean formed spontaneously, by which I also mean outside Israel's control. The grassroots movement was formed in spite of the best efforts by Israel. Here's what Israel was concerned about in the late 70s. First, Israel's immigration agency, which is a department of the intelligence services, didn't want to provoke the Soviets. They were supposedly relying on quiet diplomacy. It was so quiet that a lot of people didn't know whether it even existed. They were also urging other intelligence agencies operating in the USSR to refrain from using Jews, especially refuseniks, as assets. This was not paranoia on their part. Until the mid-1970s, CIA refrained from using any walk-ins affiliated with any public group or anyone with a public agenda as an asset. Alas, this was changing. The Jewish establishment in the U.S., to counter the work of the grassroots groups, set up the National Conference on Soviet Jewry, which looks sort of a local group, and it's kind of something called more of an astroturf group for Israeli interests. And more than anything, Israel was opposed to Soviet Jews working with the dissidents and the human rights movement. In the U.S., the grassroots groups ultimately came to support, rather immediately really came to support the dissident agenda, while the Israeli-affiliated groups, the astroturf groups, were opposed to that. So let's return to the Leningrad airplane hijacking case. consideration for a mutual friend. I don't know the details, but I mean, she had nothing to do with it. Bonner was part of the culture which emerged at the Yankelevich trial. So one tradition within that culture was to attend and document political trials. This tradition produced some very, well, a lot of important works of literature. The White Book of the Yankelevich trial is one of them, and of course there's documents of the Brodsky trial and many others. The Jewish movement also had its own documentation of trials. And at the Leningrad airplane case, at the time had the appearance of an anti-Semitic trial, kind of a new Bayless trial. And how do you know when you see one? So it's kind of a neat blood libel situation. And it's, you know, I look at it now, like really at the time, it's what noise. Perspective as an artifact. Another problem was capital punishment. Elena Georgievna described this in her recent collection of interviews that she was truly, this was where she truly noticed Andrei Sakharov while trying to monitor the trial of the Leningrad. And this is where they met, basically. Sakharov maintains interest in, main interest in the case was capital punishment in the political trial. He called for commutation of death sentences, and he wrote an open letter to President Nixon and Nikolai Makorny, asking for a fair trial of Angela Davis, who was facing charges in California, and lightening the sentences for the people in Leningrad. So the commutation of sentences really did happen, and I think he saved their lives. Now, let me skip to another moment. In 1976, when a group of dissidents, including Elena Georgievna, by then married to Sakharov, set up what became known as the Helsinki Group, which monitored Soviet performance under the Helsinki Accord signed in 1975. The group includes a spectrum of Soviet Jews, Soviet dissidents, excuse me. While it was clear that the Jewish movement was vulnerable to infiltration by the KGB, and Jews in the USSR were fighting among themselves, which we do, the Jews were a big, important movement that couldn't be ignored. You couldn't really monitor all the other ways without a right to immigration. The Helsinki Group, the initial group, included Jewish activists Vitaly Rubin and Anatoly Sharansky. Sharansky was warned, he says so, to stay away from the dissidents, especially this group, by people who purported to be carrying messages from Israel. And here's why. Letting people go is a very small ask, a relatively small ask. A dialogue with society is a very big ask, transformative. Sharansky, of course, stays within this group, though much to the distress of Israeli Motiv and the AstroTurf groups in the US. So the dissidents concerned about potential infiltration by KGB comes through the Jewish side. Sharansky's and Rubin's friend, Dr. Sonia Lipovsky, turns out to be a double agent. He is introduced to his handler by Rubin, who clearly knows what's going on. And all of this really doesn't help Sharansky one bit. I don't know, but he knew probably nothing about Lipovsky's double agent. And while Sharansky is in prison, his wife travels the world repeating his name at every city. She steered towards the grassroots groups in the US, but whenever the AstroTurf people were present, they would bring in another less challenging imprisoned refusenik, Yosef Begun, who was a Hebrew teacher. Whenever Avital Sharansky would say, Anatoly Sharansky, someone would shout, and Yosef Begun. So, if I may answer the fundamental question that brings us here, I would say that it was the Russian Democrats who tore down the Iron Curtain. The Jews helped. when they acted in defiance of Israel's wishes and within the framework of the human rights movement.
Thank you very much, Paul. And let me welcome our next speaker, and Komaromi, who will bring us from the realm of politics to liberation. Sort of.
Thank you, and I want to express my appreciation to Vasily Shugin, Anna Soljak, and the Russian and East European Studies Network for organizing this wonderful event and inviting me to participate. I'm really delighted to be with you for this discussion. As Anna's introduction indicated, my research interests have revolved around uncensored dissident publishing, or samizdat, and in collaboration with historians at the Memorial Society in Russia, I chronicled the bulletins, journals, and other samizdat periodical editions. The long-running Moscow rights activist bulletin, The Chronicle of Current Events, which ran from 1968 to 1982, was without a doubt the most famous samizdat periodical publication. And Andrei Sakharov praised the Chronicle for exemplifying, quote, the best in the human rights movement, its principles and highest achievements, the defense of human rights using objective information and with a principled rejection of violence. The very fact of the almost uninterrupted publication of the Chronicle for more than 15 years is a miracle of self-sacrifice, of wisdom, of courage, and intellectual integrity. One of the things the Chronicle was said to exemplify by its founding editor, Natalia Garbanevskaya, was the evolution of samizdat, or underground publishing, from literature to civic action. In an anonymous editorial in issue 5 in 1968, Garbanevskaya wrote, quote, samizdat is a specific form of exercising freedom of expression in our country. During the last few years, samizdat has evolved from a predominant concern with poetry and fiction towards an ever greater emphasis on journalistic and documentary writing. Samizdat, in addition to its role as a supplier of books, has begun to fulfill the functions of a newspaper. Garbanevskaya had a point. At that time, in 1968, the rights movement was taking shape and the social energy was strong. Andrei told a similar story in his famous essay entitled Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984? That's obvious reference to Orwell. That was an essay in 1969 in which he said that what had been a cultural opposition was growing into political opposition to the Soviet regime. I'll set aside what I see as some problems with the term political opposition and just acknowledge that for Amalrik, Garbanevskaya, Alexander Ginsburg, and others, this story resonated in ideological and practical terms. Soviet rights activism located its moral roots in the Russian literary tradition. Samizdat began with the circulation of poems and other literary works hand to hand. And these things facilitated the social engagement of rights activists who began to speak up and, among other things, circulate their civic appeal, as well as the Chronicle with its news of trials, arrests, extrajudicial reprisals, and repressions through these samizdat networks. Looking back, however, I think we cannot help but ask, was imminent social change, meaning impact on the regime's policies and practices, really the end point of all of their activity? And in retrospect, it is hard, as Joshua Rubinstein and Ben Nathans have acknowledged, to maintain the thesis that democratic dissidents or Jewish activists brought down the Soviet Union or even significantly impacted general policy making. So I sort of cast myself here as somewhat of a skeptic of the panel title's premise, though I'm happy to hear other opinions and discuss this point, which I think is a very interesting one. In any case, seemed productive from a research standpoint to try to think beyond this narrative from literature or cultural opposition to social activism and the teleology it implies, and to consider other points of view. As was already pointed out by Paul Goldberg, there were numerous perspectives on what people were doing and why they were doing it. The Jewish movement developed from its early social activism, with some extreme examples, and with individual and collective demands for the right to emigrate, the airplane affair about which we heard, into a much more pronounced cultural activism. And so in this way, it kind of developed in the opposite direction. Its trajectory was a sort of opposite one to that of the rights movement. The needs and perspectives of various dissident communities, and we use the term dissident more broadly than many do, not just rights activism, but also Jewish activists, also underground poets and artists. The realities of the end of détente, which meant the end of regime responsiveness, but not the end of dissident activities. I think these things compel us to ask, what if imminent social change isn't the only horizon for this type of activity? This was how Grigory Pomerantz seemed to view it in his essay, which appeared in the 1981 collection on Sakharov. He wrote, quote, "I'm more and more convinced that if the human rights movement yields any political results, it will only be in the distant future, in some entirely different era, in a completely different Russia. But the farther off that is, the more I like the human rights activists. What they are doing is hard to justify in terms of our expediency. But in their hopeless cause, there is something else besides the impossibility of political success. The possibility of remaining a human being, a step toward what Dostoevsky called a strongly developed personality. Before our eyes arose, speaking here of Sakharov, a kind of all-inclusive Leo Tolstoy with his I cannot remain silent." So Pomerantz made much of the positive moral stance, the possibility of remaining a human being that Sakharov embodied and modeled for others. And we need to bear in mind that this was in 1981, after the end of détente, a very dark period when the possibility of regime change or any impact on regime policy seemed like a distant dream. Lyudmila Alexeyeva, who was an outstanding activist and historian of the rights movement, rights defenders, as well as a friend of Sakharov, called Sakharov a global thinker, as opposed, for example, to the Russian Slavophile Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who thought in national terms. This global perspective would seem to resonate with the narrative point of view cultivated by Tolstoy, as well as with Tolstoy's clear, transparent, realistic literary style, which shares something I would argue with the clear, objective reporting in the chronicle of current events. However, Pomerantz invoked both authoritative literary traditions, that of Dostoevsky and that of Tolstoy, to frame the figure of Sakharov, who is thus both a strongly developed personality and an all-inclusive, nearly omniscient thinker who speaks up for moral principles on behalf of all. I cannot remain silent. Pomerantz's writing is delightful for its literary style, its embrace of contradictions and complementary principles. And this approach reminds us that any heuristic binary model will only be as good as its ability to endure contradiction and the test of real historical circumstances. While in opposition of Dostoevsky versus Tolstoy, Solzhenitsyn versus Sakharov, and I would say particular versus universal, might suggest some pleasing symmetry and moral and political clarity, I think Pomerantz's mixing of the two principles is more true for the dissident system overall, and probably more true for any part of it, and even for any individual, such as Sakharov. Barbara Martin, in her recent book, Dissident Histories in the Soviet Union, writes about Solzhenitsyn and other dissident historians, and defines the genre of dissident history according to its function of truth-telling. Her attention to genre helps me, as a person with a literary background, bring in Mikhail Bakhtin, who's known for his attention to genre and to the novel in particular. It is Bakhtin's notion of the chronotrope, or space-time complex in literature, that interests me. Bakhtin distinguished various types of novels, the ancient adventure novel, the Lazy folkloric chronotrope, and so forth, on the basis of their characteristic parameters for imagined space and time. I believe the chronotrope can also help us compare various types of dissident truth-telling. In part, of course, this concerns the implied or explicit spatial and temporal boundaries to which various dissidents oriented their thinking and writing. Thus, Sakharov, as a global thinker, was not limited in his thinking to one state or one community in thinking about rights, the ecology, nuclear proliferation, and international cooperation. The Jewish movement, by contrast, aimed to educate people about the history of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, casting readers' minds back to ancient events and traditions and beyond the Soviet borders to the small country of Israel in the Middle East. Of course, at the same time, Jewish activists were carrying on information and appeals campaigns related to the struggle for the right to emigrate. And this is part of universal human rights, but with an emphasis on their particular community. So in general, this chronotopic binary in the analysis of something like dissident publishing could be represented by the Chronicle on the one hand, which aimed to circulate as quickly as possible and as widely as possible, and literary journals as a counterexample, as Leningrad Poetry and Philosophy Journal 37, has its relatively small circulation and the ambition to make a mark in culture over time. And the Jewish movement, I think, sort of straddles these kind of binary principles. But a key question for research of Samizdat concerns distribution. Where did the relatively small number of copies of any given Samizdat publication go? At the end of his essay on the chronotope, Bakhtin acknowledged that he did not have time to consider the complex problem of the listener-reader, but by raising the issue of the anticipation of audience reaction within the work, Bakhtin left open the possibility that I think something like Samizdat compels us to explore, to wit, how does the actual distribution of Samizdat works enact the chronotopic framework of dissident truth-telling? Jewish Samizdat journals, while implying a long historical perspective and other particular geographical place, were also for Soviet Jews in the present. They were mainly for the readership of Soviet Jews in the Soviet Union. In my interview with Alexander Varanel in 2007, he described a friendly conversation with Andrei Sakharov. Varanel recalled asking Sakharov, why does the Soviet intelligentsia always fight for other people? Varanel spoke of his admiration of Sakharov's ability to fight for others as a rare example of the realization of a Christian ideal of self-sacrifice. However, Varanel sought to pair such ideals with care for his own community, a goal he pursued with his own Jewish Samizdat journal called Jews in the USSR. Leaders of the Jewish cultural movement, encouraged by Israeli advisors, sought to create a publication that would be kosher, which has a particular meaning in this context. That is, not irritating to Soviet authorities and not frightening for a larger group of Soviet Jewish readers who wouldn't want to be seen doing anything to Soviet. They came up with a journal called Target, Future of Culture, a journal devoted to Jewish culture that was more directly centered topic. The first issue of the Samizdat Jewish Culture journal, Target, in 1975, featured a statement by Martin Buber that must have seemed timely to Soviet readers then, even though Buber wrote it for a syllabus for Jewish youth in Germany in 1932. Buber wrote, quote, much has disappeared from Jewry in the past 150 years, but nothing is so ominous as the disappearance of the collective memory and the passion for handing it down. The rupture in Jewish life and culture in the Soviet Union defined the situation for late Soviet Jews. Publications like Uber's and Samizdat helped them realize they possessed a distinctive heritage from the Pale of Settlement and life in the Russian Empire and the early Soviet Union, and that this, moreover, is a legacy that still interested world Jewry. So Samizdat helped Soviet Jews revive their culture. That's a nice thing to remember on a holiday like Purim today. The attention to Buber and Samizdat is another way to demonstrate how Jewish Samizdat was oriented to particular geographies, in this case also the Pale settlement, and a cultural history that transcended the present struggle, but was also related to that present concern. Buber's notion of dialogue, intriguingly similar to and distinct from Bakhtin's concept of dialogue, implies a transformation. For Buber, this is a turning to others that makes possible an authentic sense of I, developed in dialogue with members of the community, recognized as authentic others, under the sign of thou. Bakhtin wrote about the chronotope as the imagined or created context for the human figure. And I think this is what Dissidents made possible, a realization of the potential to remain or become a human being in dialogue with one's fellows and the community and with others, with other communities. And this pluralism is the necessary ideal embodied by Sakharov in all of his writing and activity. I'll end with a quote from the brilliant literary author Vladimir Vainovich, speaking about Sakharov. Quote, I have heard people express the opinion that human rights, about which Sakharov talks so much, are a secondary matter, that a national or religious rebirth is much more important. But without human rights, there can be no rebirth. Without them, there can only be either decay or, in the best, more accurately, in the worst case, a change of ideology and a rapid movement of the masses from one swamp into another. I would say we still need Sakharov today to show us the way out of the swamp. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me welcome our last speaker, Tatiana.
Trying to straighten my back is almost as hard as straightening my thoughts. But what I wanted to say, kind of a, what do you call it? I will probably be the least prepared of the panelists because I was. It was on the spur of the moment that it was decided that I will join this discussion. So my comments will be probably the briefest and the least expert remarks. And I wish to speak mostly as a witness to some of the episodes in the history of human rights, as well as human rights movement in Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s, and the Jewish activist movement around the same time in the same country. By destiny or chance, I was a witness to one of the most defining moments in the history of Jewish activist movement, and the movement to return to what was called the historic homeland, meaning Israel. I want to say, kind of a pre-qualifier, right away that Sakharov always held a very firm and very outspoken position on the right of anyone to choose one's country of residence. And this is probably one of the major points where he differs with Solzhenitsyn, who had a very different kind of look at what Sakharov considered the fundamental human rights as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So after saying that, I just want to go back to my testimony as a witness. The so-called Samolетчики episode took place in 1970, and that was the attempt to hijack a plane without any people on it by a small group of Jewish activists who wished to leave the Soviet Union, who, after exhausting all legal means, decided that this would be the only way for them to leave. And if they were doomed, which I think many of them thought they were, at least they will have attracted the world's attention to this issue. And again, by sheer chance or possibly destiny, providence, my mother was kind of pretended, but she had the power of attorney from the mother of one of the leaders of this group, Eduard Kuznetsov. And she was allowed to attend the trial as his aunt with the power of attorney from his mother, who was incapacitated or felt that she could not bring herself to attend the trial. And it was an interesting, one point I want to draw your attention to is that there was a very small group of people, thanks to whom the news of the trial came out in the open and in the West and attracted the world's attention to this cause. And that group consisted of my mother, who, as some of you know, by birth, she is half Armenian, half Jewish, and by Jewish laws, she is Jewish. But of course, we didn't know all that at the time. I only learned about it much later, that this is how the ethnicity is decided in the Jewish law by your mother. And so by that law, I am Jewish too. My grandmother on my mother's side, my mother and myself are Jewish. The rest of this group consisted of at least two, sometimes three persons who had nothing to do with Jewish movement and were not Jewish by ethnicity at all. One of them was the celebrated Soviet dissident Vladimir Bukovsky, who passed away just last year. And the other one was a kind of early dissident, Vladimir Telnikov. And yet another person was a kind of a civil wife before Kuznetsov was married during his first prison term, Bela Kaval. Now, Kuznetsov himself, by Jewish law, was not Jewish because it was his father, Gerson, who was. And by Soviet law, of course, the ethnicity that was written in the passport was by the father. But when his father died, his mother made a decision to register him under her last name, and he became Kuznetsov. So by Jewish laws, he was not Jewish, but then he was recognized as a prisoner of Zion, because the case became so celebrated that even in Israel, the very conservative circles would not be able to resist it. And so he became one of the group of people who were released early in 1979. They were all released as these were the people who were considered prisoners of Zion because of their sacrifice to the cause of the Jewish return to the historic motherland. Interestingly enough, two more members of the group, Alexander Gurchenko and Yuri Fedorov, were not considered Jews or prisoners of Zion, and therefore they served their 15-year term from, as they used to call it, Atzvanka, from bell to bell, translating literally the Soviet informal expression. So I just I'm bringing your attention to these various details or aspects of this case because I think that it is very kind of illustrative of how the dissident movement, speaking broadly, developed in the early stages. There were really nor Ellen nor Jew. Is that the right expression? Ni element ni Iudea. Speaking in Russian, this is from the Bible. So no distinction between nationalities, ethnic origin, and so forth. It was more or less a mixed bag, everyone together. In the early stages, there were people who later became ultra-nationalists, Russian Orthodox, prominently pro-Russian way, and so forth. And the Jewish movement had defined itself later than the very beginning, the early stages of the dissident movement. And of course, the human rights movement started to define itself with such very important major events as Anne just mentioned, Chronicle of Current Events, and the Initiative Group on Human Rights, and then the Moscow Committee of Human Rights in which Sakharov participated, and of course the kind of counterpunctual event 1976, because the Moscow Helsinki Watch Group, which started, by the way, started worldwide movement in not just the Soviet republics, first the Soviet republics, then Greater Eastern Europe, and finally in New York and other countries, in the United States and in other countries. And this movement swept practically the entire world, and it had set new and very universal, I would say, criteria as to what universal human rights are. And so from here, I want to kind of jump to another development within the dissident movement that I witnessed as early as the kind of mid-70s or so, and then when I was already a political immigrant, or using American slang, an immigrant in the United States. It has come to a head, and I was a witness from afar of very unfortunate events. And by all this, I mean the tactics, or I would say the strategy rather, by the KGB to what I call to divide and conquer, or divide and destroy. And that tactic was kind of slow and gradual in the mid-70s or so because of the international attention to the Soviet Union in conjunction with the Helsinki Accords of 1975. It was rather underhanded, and then it became more and more prominent. And finally, in the early 1980s, 82, 83, it became completely victorious. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean the strategy that kind of, how shall I put it, blackmailed the Jewish movement to seize all collaboration with human rights movement, scare tactics, like we will draw, your son will be drafted into the army, and we will send him into to secret, to installations where he will acquire clearance and very high, very restricted clearance, and he will not be able to leave the country ever, or that he will never be able to leave unless you cease contacts with the human rights activists, of which they were becoming less and less in the 1970s. In 1975, Sergei Kovalyov, some name may be familiar to you, I can talk about him later privately, was tried and sentenced, and he was one of the very close people to Sakharov, and he was also one of the foremost editors of Chronicle of Current Events, and so forth. So from that time on, it became increasingly, difficult to find common ground between for human rights activists with Jewish activists, and also, of course, with the Sharansky arrested just shortly after that. It was also became scare tactics of the KGB to promise the same fate to other Jewish activists, and most of them have become very pliable, and they collaborated, which is, I'm sorry to say, but that is the fact, not that they became provocateurs or direct, agent, whatever, agents of KGB, but they became, as I said, very pliable, and they have gradually seized all contacts with the human rights movement, to the point, and I will end with this, when Sharansky's mother was not able to find a place in Moscow to hold a press conference about her son's treatment in the camp and in prison. The only place until 1984, I'll explain why, was my mother's apartment in Moscow, where my mother would call foreign correspondents, foreign journalists, and gather them over there, and Edith Petrovna, Sharansky's mother, Sharansky being an eminent hero of Jewish movement, she would come there to speak about her son's condition. That was very tragic. And I would also add that there were numerous cases when if foreigners come to see the Jews in Moscow, Jewish activists first, foreigners like statesmen, different representatives of different human rights organizations and Jewish organizations, and if they expressed their wish to see Sakharov until 1980, when Sakharov was exiled into the closed city of Gorky, or afterwards to see my mother while she was still free to come to Moscow. Sadly, the Jewish activists would advise against such meetings. So that is a very, very sad story of how something that had been so, I would say, successful in bringing the world's attention to these important, fundamental, universal human rights, how all of this was subverted and undermined by the KGB. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now we have a round of comments by panelists. It's not compulsory, so if you like to comment, you're more than welcome, and then we'll open the floor for the questions and comments from the audience.
was nice to start with what Gordon had to say, because in 1953, on March 6th, it wasn't necessarily clear. Some people were dancing in the streets, some people were not really in the streets, but we're celebrating. But a lot of people cried, including my friend and co-author, Yuda Alexeyeva, just burst into tears. My father, who was not really terribly knowledgeable at the time, wrote a poem about Stalin's death. How can time move past this sort of idea, this moment, this tragic moment when Comrade Stalin is no longer with us. And the ending of that poem, I'll never forget this one, is Сталин, любимый, ты слышишь нас, мы, дети твои, говорим в этот суровый и скорбный час, идем на твоим. Stalin, beloved, please hear us. It is us, your children, who speak. In this sad but narrow hour of sorrow, we will follow your path. And my father is so it's kind of a huge thing, because how long does it take to absorb horrendous events? How many centuries? I mean, if you really think about it, the guy who did the most for Jewish literature is Adolf Hitler, because we're still, Jewish writers like me are still writing about the Holocaust and things like Holocaust. So in that sense, Stalin is still very much, so it's kind of like, there's nothing really shocking about this speech in some strange way. So, and it's illuminating. Anne's comments were really fascinating too, but there I have to really say that the 1970s were a time of just incredible fundamental change culturally, because people really started to feel that pressure to declare who they are, and you could feel it. For Jews, this was particularly difficult because, to quote Vasili's paper on the subject, they were the model minority for giving up their culture. So I was there, and I was there as a kid, and I felt that pressure. And it was beneath the surface, and it was powerful. So it is a time of change. And also, it's sort of fascinating to see fiction and nonfiction playing against each other in this, because really here's a movement that begins with novels and poems, and then turns into something else. But how can you really tell? Would you really say that Dueck говорит Moskva is it fiction or is it nonfiction? I mean, I wrote a novel about the same thing. Yeah, it's exactly about that. So anyway, as far as the transformative, the actual impact, and this is really kind of what Anne said, what Tanya said, is the biggest is the impact of the movement. And the impact of the movement is changing the culture, is the first and foremost bit. And it's like all over what you said. You can just feel it. That there's, you can go very quickly from Tolstoy to Gandhi to Martin Luther King to Sakharov, and once you've got that much, the world changes. And I think the change that we're also saying, that the movement became a worldwide movement based on nonviolence and so forth. I mean, listening, I was really worried about what Tanya was going to say about what I had to say, because I'm really worried about not being able to understand the airplane. The more I learn about it, including now, the less I understand it. But that may be the perspective issue, because perspective is an artifact. Seeing that these guys had a gun just obviously as a rights issue and a capital punishment issue. It's maybe something else, maybe more acceptable, I don't know. And also was there, it was very scary, and I was like down the street from you. It was incredibly scary to hear people speak about that, because what are we? We're Jews, and oh my God, what in the world is that? And then the other bit that was fascinating was the story of Goldberg. That was fascinating. I'm fascinated that we now are at the point where you can discuss these matters and these schisms. Thank you for it.
Thank you, Paul.
Don't really have any synthesizing comments. There were just some questions that came to me as I was listening to the speakers. Thank you so much for them. For Professor Dueck, I loved hearing about David Salzberg, someone I've had the privilege of researching just a little bit, but I came to him from the Soviet Jewry angle. And my question is really because I feel like I encountered some skepticism that his activism on behalf of Soviet Jewry was even really worth writing much about, as compared to that kind of heroic period of communist activity and engagement. So I just wondered what you think, whether you have any knowledge or opinion of what kind of activist he was after he leaves the Communist Party and in the 60s he sort of begins to get engaged on Soviet Jewry, which is that issue of this time, but a very different one from sort of communism. And then Paul Goldberg, thank you so much for your fascinating comments, and I can only address maybe one little point that I wanted to ask you about. You already acknowledged that the hijacking plot is something that is hard for us to even kind of get our minds around. I can't imagine what it was like at the time. You sort of mentioned the airplane hijacking plot in conjunction with JBL, and I wonder whether you think there's a similarity in resorting to the tactics of violence. No, that's all right. I'm sure you'll say no, but I just wonder what the...
No, there is.
Okay.
I'll say yes.
Okay, you can say yes. And certainly it's what attracts attention in both of them. There's a sort of, as I've read about it, and I don't know that much about it, but a kind of one-time ad hoc attempt to quote-unquote hijack a plane with a gun that had no bullets in it seems very different from a sustained principled commitment to tactics of violence and intimidation on the part of JBL. So just wondered about that. And maybe about, you used the term AstroTurf groups.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear you talk about which groups those were. I'm guessing you mean the US groups?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's also an interesting kind of tension between the establishment Jewish groups and the grassroots, or those who thought of themselves as that. And then finally, just on Eduard Kuznetsov's relationship to Elena Donner. We read about her as his aunt, and I actually just don't know how she came, what was the connection, how was she given this power of attorney, how did she get to be serving in this position on his behalf?
I don't have much to add to the discussion. I have already posed my questions to all of you in my remarks.
So I just wanted to answer Anne's question and then listen to the other distinguished panelists' responses to her question. We came to know Kuznetsov in a very not peculiar, but it may seem peculiar to the present audience, but something that was very normal in my family. My grandmother served time in the Gulag. Her good friend served time in the Gulag. friend had a son who, by the time that she was about to be released in the late 40s, was already arrested for unless I'm mistaken, but I think I'm very close to truth, for writing a letter to Stalin with his ideas how to correct the situation in the country. So her young son was in the camp, and then and he served quite a long term, I think, of 15 years or so. And there he met Eduard Kuznetsov, who was arrested for the underground, I don't like the word, but that's how they usually act, for uncensored magazine. Was it Syntaxis, I think? No, not Syntaxis. Syntaxis is yeah. Phoenix, yes, that's right, Phoenix. Syntaxis is Goldberg. And yeah, so this young man came to the camp where this other man, who was about 10 years older, was already serving his term. And when Felix was, the older one, named Felix, when he was released, he kind of followed up with Kuznetsov in the camp, corresponded with him, and when Kuznetsov was released, the first place where he came to, Felix brought him over to our apartment, and that's how we met. We were the first family, first people that he met after his release in 1966 or 7, I can't remember exactly, and he became fast friends with my mother, myself, and my younger brother. And my younger brother, here I want to tell you a story, was an avid reader of all sorts of literature across the board. And Eduard, or Edik as we used to call him, he had no right to stay in Moscow. He had to find a place to live about 100 kilometers away from Moscow, and it was a industrial city, Alexandrov, where he lived in most horrendous circumstances. No one would want to rent a room. So he was renting a kind of a corner, a bed basically, in a dormitory, workers' dormitory, workers' barracks basically, where there was drunkenness, there were brawls, there was obscene language, and he couldn't wait to escape for 2 days over the weekend. And he would come to our house, and my brother was reading a book, so Kuznetsov asked him, "What are you reading?" He says, "Well, I'm reading the diary of a man sentenced to death by Victor Hugo." And my brother loved to quote and says, "Oh, wait, my brother is 14 years old. Just listen to this." And Eduard Kuznetsov says, "Oh, come on, I'm not really interested in all these dealings with death sentences and all that." So in 2 years or 3 years after that, he himself is sentenced to death. And my mother, when his sentence is commuted on December 31st, 1970, sends him a telegram. And he was not allowed telegrams before the verdict is delivered to the prison. But the warden of the prison comes in and says, holds the telegram in his hand and says, "Well, Kuznetsov, looks like we are gonna to live." The telegram said, "Congratulations on the new year and life." So that was the story of our acquaintance with